Friends, we're exploring Look at the Sichas, volume 11, Beshalach, Sicha number 3. At the outset, I need to say that I'm only covering certain points in the Sicha. I don't endeavor to cover the entire Sicha, rather to take a few points and make them clear and accessible to people on all levels. This is something that I do with a local class in my own Chabad house. And now I share the same spreadsheet and the same approach on the project Likutei Sichos for those interested in that style of study of the Sicha. But by no means is this class the full entire Sicha, although we're going to touch upon three major points: the Talmudic, the lessons that we take from the Eruv Chatzeris, closing in an Eruv on the public domain to make it a private domain, and also the difference between that and the expansion of the Tchum of the Shabbos boundary. So we're going to touch upon a lot of the Sicha, but I just want to put it out there. It's not the full Sicha. Okay. So the Sicha is based on a siyum. The Rabbi made a siyum completing the tractate of Eruvin, which is the third tractate of the Talmud after Brachot, which is a tractate about prayers and blessings. The second tractate, a large tractate all about Shabbat. And then the third tractate, a separate tractate on its own, the laws of Eruv, which is curious. And it points to the fact that Eruv has to be something really important, because otherwise it could have just been incorporated into the tractate of Shabbos. And yet, no, it's a separate tractate. And the Rebbe makes a siyum, which is a special celebration and a study when he completed that tractate. And it's customary then to focus on the end and give it meaning and significance. It's related to this week's Torah portion because it's connected to a verse in the Torah portion where we learn the laws of Shabbos. They are first introduced in this Torah portion. The Jewish people are getting the manna. This is already pre-Sinai, and they're told that they have to start keeping Shabbos already now. Don't collect the manna on Shabbos. Double portion will be on Friday, etc. Don't cook it on Shabbos. Prepare it before. And then it says a law: Al yetze ish mimkomo b'yom Shabbat. Man should not leave his place on Shabbos, which is interpreted to mean not to leave outside of 2,000 amots or cubits, which is a biblical measure, which is an amma is somewhere between 18 inches and 24 inches. You should not leave your space more than 2,000 amma on Shabbat. And what this means is that on Shabbat, a person is allowed to walk the entire city. We're not talking about traveling, we're talking about walking. So there's no problem with the means of transportation. You're walking. However, there's a limit to that too. The Torah is telling us here that when you come to the end of your city and you want to keep walking out into the outer areas, the forest, the wilderness, and what have you, limit yourself to what's called Tchum Shabbat, the limit of Shabbat, which is 2,000 cubits. Like I said, that's loosely around 3,000 feet. And we learned this out from the fact that it says, do not leave your place. Your place is a word that's used elsewhere in biblical language. And there it also means 2,000 cubits. And our sages teach us that whenever it says your place, it means 2,000 cubits. You're not allowed to leave a city limits and go beyond it more than 2,000 cubits. Just the relevance for nowadays, in most places, unless you're in very rural areas, you can walk a whole bunch, because when one city finishes, the next one begins. And at no time are you in an environment that there's no city around you for 2,000 cubits. So I'm on Long Island, I probably can walk the entire island, I'm guessing, because when one city ends, there's another city. Even if there isn't a city, there's a couple of houses here and there. However, if you, back in the day, in the olden days where there were shtetls, and then in between, it was no man's land, there was nothing. It was a much bigger issue. Similar to now, if you go upstate, you go to the Catskills, wherever it is you go to, very rural areas, you might have small communities, but then outside, it's just trees. And you need to watch out. People go to the bungalow colonies, the summer camps. Shabbos afternoon is not a good day for a long hike, because there's a prohibition not to go more than the 2,000 cubits outside, let's call it, of civilization. There's also an Eruv that can be employed to allow you to expand that. If you go before Shabbos to that spot, that limit of Tchum Shabbat, your Shabbat limit to 2,000 cubits, and you put 2 meals, you put in some safe way, you put your meals for Shabbat, Now you're sort of saying my Shabbat is not in the city, but my Shabbat is there. And then on Shabbat, I have permission to go to that place and beyond it, an additional 2,000 cubits. People would do this because they want to get to another village, because there was a guest rabbi there was a guest sage, there was a simcha in the other city, but they wanted to be home in their city, so long as they can, that it's not more than 4,000 cubits between the two cities. They plant their Eruv, as it's called, which makes it allowable for them to walk from the city to the Eruv, and from the Eruv now, an additional 2,000 cubits. Not to be confused with the traditional word Eruv, but it's similar, but different, that if there is an area where you're not allowed to carry, like in communities, many communities, you're not allowed to carry, but you're not allowed to carry rabbinically because it's not a biblical public domain. Biblical public domain means an area where 600,000 plus people pass through every single day, like a highway or an expressway. There's no way you can put an Eruv around that. But if there is a rabbinic public domain, so it's sort of in between a private domain, like my own private property, and the very public domain, like Midtown Manhattan, but most, let's call it suburban towns, where there's nowhere close to 600,000 people passing through any given street on any given day, that area is called, in the Talmud, a Carmelis, which is a semi-public domain. It's public in that it's not belong to any individual. However, it's not public in that it doesn't have the traffic to be a biblical public domain. That would be a place which is biblically not public. Rabbinically, it is. The sages prohibited you from carrying there on Shabbat, lest you confuse it with a regular public domain. And therefore, the sages also gave an allowability, which is an Eruv, by circling that area around that space. I'm on Long Island, where many small towns have an Eruv, but they all end at the expressway. If you go to the ramp of the expressway, you'll see the string hanging over the ramp, because there's no way you can put an Eruv on an expressway. It's a biblical public domain, and you cannot decide to change that. But the more traditional Eruv on a semi-public domain would be courtyards. Apparently back in the day, you still have it today in cul-de-sacs, small gated communities, where there was one big courtyard and there were a bunch of homes, let's say there were 10 homes, and they shared that one courtyard. So it's not private because it's owned by 10 families, but it's not public because it's just those families, and they were allowed to make an Eruv by enclosing it and also putting food, which they all shared in one place, and it's called an Eruv. So this is the long and short of the concept of Eruv. It's used in some other places as well, but primarily the discussion today is two types of Eruv. Eruv Techumim, allowability for you to carry past your Shabbos limit of 2,000 cubits by pre-Shabbos placing food in that location. And another concept of Eruv, known as Eruv Chatzerot, an Eruv to enclose a courtyard or to enclose a semi-public domain or a non-biblical public domain by enclosing it with a symbolic string and having food in one place, which technically are shared by everyone. And they both use the same term Eruv, because nominally an Eruv means a reminder that this is not normal and this is only allowed by an extension. It is said that the word Eruv, by the way, has various meanings. Eruv means a mixing. It's like the plague in Egypt of the mixed multitude of animals was called arov. Eruv means sweetness, and Eruv means a guarantor. Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh, we're all guarantors for one another. And all three meanings apply in an Eruv. It's mixing up people together. It's giving us sweetness. When we're all together, we're sweeter. And the reason why it's allowable is because ultimately we're all guarantors for one another. We are all one family. So this is just by way of introduction, because we're talking today about the siyum of the tractate of Eruv. And we will be talking about in our class, we're touching upon both these type of Eruvs, the Eruv expanding your Shabbos limit from 2,000 cubits to beyond, and the Eruv of enclosing a semi-public area and making it private and thereby allowable to carry. Now let's get into the actual study. So the Rabbi looks at the last Mishnah, the last statement in the tractate of Eruvin, zeroes in on it. I'm going to bring it up on the spreadsheet in a moment. And the Rebbe says it talks about 3 different laws, among some others. And the Rebbe is going to wonder what's the connection. There's nothing random in the Talmud. There's nothing random in anything in Torah, specifically in the Mishnah, which was written very precisely and concisely. And the fact that certain things are juxtaposed together in the same Mishnah, and not just the same Mishnah, but this is the last final Mishnah of the entire tractate of Eruvin, it's clearly pivotal by nature to the entire tractate, and it's clearly that all these 3 statements are interrelated. Let's open up the screen and start to look at these 3 statements. Final Mishnah tractate, Eruvin, case number 1 is a statement made by Rabbi Shimon. Case number 2 is also a statement made by Rabbi Shimon. For some reason, Rabbi Shimon was given the kuvod, he was given the right to finish the tractate, and he makes 2 public statements. He makes them very, in a way of a hint. He makes them in a way of a hint. However, I am simplifying what those statements allude to according to the Talmud for clarity and for simplification. But if you looked at the original translation of the Sicha, you know he wrote them in a very cryptic fashion. That's the word. So the last Mishnah has 2 statements from Rabbi Shimon, and then it has a 3rd separate statement, and we're going to discuss the connection. Case number 1 is somebody arrives at the Shabbos limit at sunset. They're traveling from out of town. They're coming back home. It's almost Shabbos. And apparently around every Jewish city, at that point of the Shabbos limit, that 2,000 cubit point, the rabbinic court would put up signs, let's call it stop signs, whatever it is, and say, here's where the Shabbos limit ends, lest people forget and walk beyond it. So there were those signs. And he's traveling in and he sees the sign and he just misses it. It's sunset. What does he do? And Rabbi Shimon says he should go in. He's allowed and he's even encouraged to enter the city. Don't spend Shabbos out here alone, outside, just a few feet outside those markers. Go in. Whereas the other sages disagree and they say, no. It's sunset. Stay there. Obviously, we're assuming that there's no danger of life and he can survive it. Too bad. You didn't plan correctly. It's Shabbos. It's sunset. You're not supposed to violate the law of the Tchum Shabbos, of the Shabbos limit. You came to the markers that the rabbinic court put up around the city. You didn't quite get in. It's too bad. I don't care if you're a foot away. That is the other's opinion. But Rabbi Shimon, who was cited in that last Mishnah, says, no. Enter the city. Go for it. I want you to have a good Shabbos. Case number 2 that Rabbi Shimon cites. What happens if a Levite is playing the harp in the temple on Shabbos? Normally, we don't play music on Shabbos. It's a rabbinic prohibition for various reasons. In the temple, the rabbinic prohibitions did not apply, and therefore they played the harp on Shabbos. What happens, and the Levites would be the ones playing it, what happens if one of the strings snaps? What do? It's really important to play the harp on Shabbos. So the other opinion is, not Rabbi Shimon, you should knot it. Playing the harp on Shabbos is really important. You should perhaps knot it. Says Rabbi Shimon, no, don't knot it. Bow it. Bow it. Because knotting would be a violation of a biblical prohibition of Shabbat. It's one of the 39 laws. You're not allowed to make a permanent knot. Making a bow is only a rabbinic prohibition. I need to point out that making a bow is only rabbinically prohibited in the case when you intend for it to last more than, let's say, that day. So if you're tying your shoes and you're making a bow, that's completely fine. There's no prohibition whatsoever because the understanding is you're going to undo it at the end of the day. However, if you're going to make a bow that's intended to last, then even a bow is rabbinically prohibited. Parenthetically, that's why some people say that if you're making a tie on Shabbos, which is not a knot, it's a bow. By the way, how do you know something is a bow? You can undo it with one hand. So it's really fine to make a tie on Shabbos, but that is only if you're one of those people who undoes their tie each time. But if you're making a tie on Shabbos morning, and there's a very good chance that you're not going to undo it, and you just leave it hanging in your closet, as some people do, it's questionable. You might be violating a rabbinic prohibition. So a bow, which is meant to be, so to speak, permanent, lasting bow, is a rabbinic prohibition. Says Rabbi Shimon, I have 2 choices. The harp string just snapped. I can either make a knot or I can make a bow. He says, no, you can't make a knot. I know the harp is really important. It's in the temple, but you cannot make a knot, bow it. Because this way you're not violating a biblical prohibition. And then there's a third case in that Mishnah. It's not Rabbi Shimon, it's just a separate other sages. And the question there is, if they found a sheretz, an impure rodent, in the temple, we know that there are certain forms of impurity, tumah, in the Torah, which make a person or an object ritually impure, the highest level of which is coming in touch with a dead body. And if one is ritually impure, they cannot enter the temple and they cannot bring sacrifices and do certain things before they go to the mikveh or before they have the red heifer. There's various levels of impurity that require various levels of purification. And suffice it to say that in the temple, everything and everyone must be completely pure. Now, one of the levels of impurity, it's a low level of impurity, albeit, is a sheretz. When you find a rodent, the Torah describes 8 rodents which are considered to be impure, and if they touch something that is renders it impure. What happens if you find a rodent in the temple? You have impurity in the place of holiness. It's a problem. You want to get rid of it as soon as possible. But here there are 2 opinions. One opinion is the Kohen that finds it should take his sash. Every Kohen had a sash. It was one of the 8 garments, or one of the 4 garments that they wore. Take the sash, take hold of the rodent, and take it outside. The problem with that is, though, that a sash, like any garment, like any vessel, can carry impurity, can contract impurity. But that sage says, no, you want to get rid of it as soon as possible, not to prolong the impurity. The other opinion says, no, don't use your sash. Find a tool, a wooden tool, like a wooden tongs, set of tongs, which are, since they're wooden, they don't contract impurity. And therefore, although it may take some time to find the wooden tongs, they're not sitting around, but nevertheless, you will find it and you will then not have to add and increase the impurity by having your sash become impure. So these are the 2 opinions of that additional case in the Mishnah. And the Rebbe's question in the Sicha is, what's the connection? And why is this the final Mishnah in the tractate? And what's the connection between the first and second case of Rabbi Shimon? And what is the connection of these 2 to the case of the rodent? So to explain this, the Rebbe is extremely creative and brilliant, one might say, in juxtaposing this and comparing this to a whole different area of Jewish law related to the laws of Shabbat, where there is a different question that arises. Let's take a look now on line 3. Somebody is sick on Shabbos, in a danger of life. The rule is, if there's danger of life, you break Shabbat. If somebody's sick and it's not a danger of life, you try not to break Shabbat. You do it in a way that you do it with a non-Jew, because breaking Shabbat through a non-Jew, unless he's your illegal slave, which hopefully he or she is not, so then it's not, the breaking Shabbat with a non-Jew is a rabbinic prohibition, so that we don't make Shabbat like weekday. So if someone's sick, not in life danger, you get a non-Jew to do it, and it's not an issue. But if it's life danger, potential life danger, a Jew should break Shabbat. It is totally fine. You don't have to go looking for a non-Jew. However, we try to minimize the violation of Shabbat if we can. So here the person is sick. The doctor said he must eat meat or chicken, whatever it might be. It was decided for the value of the medicine, whatever it is, or for his health, he must have it. But there's no kosher meat around. There's only non-kosher meat, nevelo. Perhaps a kosher animal that was slaughtered in a non-kosher way. It is non-kosher. And we have 2 choices. We can feed the person the non-kosher meat, or we can slaughter an animal in a kosher way. Let's assume that all the other work that has to be done to make that slaughtered animal edible, cleansing and cooking, could perhaps be done by non-Jews, so there's no other violation, but the slaughtering must be done by a Jew. So these are the 2 sides of the equation. Do we slaughter the animal, or do we feed the person the non-kosher meat? Do we violate Shabbos, or do we violate kashrus? So the discussion is Shabbos violation is considered a greater violation than kosher. Shabbos is considered the greatest thing. It's on par with idolatry, because Shabbos is a confirmation of faith in God. So violating Shabbos is a greater quality violation. So that would be the argument: don't slaughter the animal, let him eat non-kosher. Non-kosher is a big problem, but Shabbos is a bigger problem. Conversely, there's another argument. If I slaughter the animal, I did one violation. If I eat non-kosher, if I feed the person non-kosher, with every bite he's eating non-kosher, so the quantity of the violation is much greater. This becomes a discussion. Take a look in line 10. I have it in big. This is the central point of the entire Talmudic discussion of the Sicha. What is greater? Do we worry about a quality violation versus a greater quantity violation? So in column A, if I slaughter the animal, I am breaking Shabbos, which Shabbos is considered a greater quality violation. By the way, you can see it from the punishments of Shabbos, from the cleansing, atonement of Shabbos. It's much greater than any other sin because Shabbos is up there. It's an essential confirmation of our faith. So if I slaughter the animal, it's a qualitative greater sin than eating non-kosher. However, if I eat non-kosher, it's a lesser quality violation, but there's more quantity. With every bite, the person is eating non-kosher, whereas the slaughtering would be just one act. And that becomes the yin and the yang. And Jewish law rules, as I have bolded in line 4, slaughter the kosher animal. Because Jewish law says it is preferable to violate one bigger sin than to violate many lesser sins. And this is a Talmudic halachic principle. And then the Rabbi says there's another law of Shabbos on line 6 and 7, which is similar, but we're going to see the ruling is different. The sick person didn't eat meat. He needed warm wine. It was decided for the medicinal value, he must have wine warmed up. Whatever the circumstances, this is pre-penicillin. I guess they had to be creative. So what do? I have a choice. I can have a Jew cook up the wine, or I can have a non-Jew cook up the wine. If I have a Jew cook up the wine, it's a biblical prohibition. A Jew broke Shabbos to produce this. If I have a non-Jew cook up the wine, the problem is that drinking wine that a non-Jew touched is a rabbinic prohibition. It's prohibited. Biblical prohibition is when a non-Jew uses wine for the ritual idolatry service. However, the rabbis made a fence around that rule and said that any wine that a non-Jew touches has some religious connotation and therefore it should be avoided. Even if it wasn't done in the context of a religious service, we do not drink wine that a non-Jew touched. Wine has religious significance rabbinically. And therefore, the way we get around that is that we pasteurize the wine. It's called mevushal, because pasteurized wine was never used for any ritual services. It wasn't worthy for the temple service either. And therefore, that is the exception. That's why if you go into a kosher restaurant or you buy kosher wine, by and large today, they come with a little mark that says mevushal pasteurized. So back to our case. The person is sick. They need the warm wine. We can have a Jew violate Shabbos to cook the wine. We can have a non-Jew cook the wine, but now the Jew is violating the proscription, the prohibition of drinking non-Jewish wine, if you will. And here too, it seems like to be very similar to the case above. It's either a one-time violation that he cooks up the wine and then we're done, or it's a constant violation. With every sip of the wine is another little violation. He's drinking what's called stam yenam, wine of a Gentile, with every sip. So one would, and here the law, interestingly, comes down in the other way, and that's why I bolded column B, let a non-Jew prepare it. And one would say, if the logic, according to line 4, is that we prefer a greater quality sin, but just do it once, versus repeated sins, and that's why slaughter the animal versus feeding him the available non-kosher. How come we don't have the same logic in line 7? Let a Jew cook the wine. It's a terrible violation of Shabbos, but it's a one violation. And then he drinks wine instead of constantly by every sip violating the sin, the law of drinking non-Jewish wine. And yet the law comes down as column B that let a non-Jew prepare it. So it's explained in Jewish law. The difference is that you can't compare. It's apples and oranges. In the first case, both are biblical. Slaughtering a kosher animal is a biblical prohibition on Shabbos. Feeding him non-kosher meat is also a biblical prohibition. So yes, breaking Shabbos is a step up. It's biblical plus because it's one of the greatest prohibitions. But nominally, both are biblical prohibitions. Breaking Shabbos or eating non-kosher. And therefore, they're both, all things are equal. All things are equal. We'd rather do one slightly bigger one than many slightly lesser violations. However, in line 7, it's biblical versus rabbinic. Because for a Jew to cook on Shabbos is a biblical violation. For one to drink wine that a non-Jew cooked, not explicitly doing so for idolatry, is a rabbinic prohibition. And therefore, even though this would seem to be worse because it's continuous, it's more quantity, but you can't compare it. You don't make the quality versus quantity argument. When one is biblical, one is rabbinic, they're not on the same level. So this is an analysis that the Rabbi borrows from a different area of Jewish law related to Shabbos in general, teaching us the concept that number one, when we have a choice of quality violation versus many quantity, we choose the quality. We don't want to have many small sins. We'd rather have one bigger one. However, that does not apply if the two options are not equal. One is biblical, one is rabbinic. Now that we have that information, says the Rebbe, brilliantly applying that same logic to the last Mishnah in the tractate of Eruvin. The Rebbe says these are not three unrelated cases. There's a thread here. And the thread is exactly the discussion of the quality versus the quantity. And that would make sense of the fact that it's the last Mishnah in the entire tractate. It's not just an individual law. It's pivotal. It's central. It's a system in Jewish law. It's not just an individual law. Analyze it. Case number one, the guy arrives at the Shabbos limit at sunset. Should he enter or should he not? Well, let's see. If he enters, he did a violation, but it's one violation. If he doesn't enter, he's going to do many violations of the fact that he's not enjoying Shabbos, and we know it's a mitzvah to enjoy Shabbos. It's a mitzvah to take pleasure in Shabbos. And therefore, Reb Shimon's opinion is it's better to do the one violation than to do the continuous violation of not enjoying Shabbos. And why is column A worse than column B in terms of qualitatively? Because in column A, he's breaking the rule, so to speak, with an action. In column B, he's breaking it with an inaction. An action is always worse than an inaction. So while in column A, he's actually crossing that threshold into the city and he's passing those stop signs. So he's doing an action that's violating the law. In column B, if he decided not to enter the city, as is the opinion of some, he would be violating every moment that he's not having the proper pleasure. It's not so much fun. It's not so pleasurable to spend the whole Shabbat alone out there in the field. And every single moment he's violating it. But it's a violation that came by inaction, which categorically is considered less serious than a violation that comes by action. So the choice is a greater quality violation in column A versus many quantity violations in column B. And therefore, Reb Shimon rules, go with column A, enter the city. Then Rabbi Shimon says in case number 2 in line 18, remember the story with the Levite whose harp lost a string? Says Rabbi Shimon, if you knot it, you're only going to have one violation, albeit a more serious one. It's a biblical one. But why only one? Because chances are if you knot it, it'll last for the duration. If you bow it, on the other hand, it's a rabbinic prohibition, so it's lesser in quality, it's a lower quality violation. But chances are, if you only bow it, it may come undone again and again and again throughout the day, and you're going to have to bow it again and again and again. So here you have a choice, quality versus quantity. And by the logic of line 16 that Rabbi Shimon says, in accordance with Jewish law that we learned earlier in line 4, that you opt to do one quality sin versus many quantity sins. And therefore, Reb Shimon said, let him enter the city versus staying outside. How come when it comes to the knot, Reb Shimon says, don't knot it and bow it? You're liable to end up doing many quantity violations of bowing versus one violation of nodding. Says the Rebbe, we'll take a look. This lines up perfectly to the top part of our chart, the other halachic ruling. How could you compare bowing to nodding? Bowing is a rabbinic prohibition. Nodding is biblical. And as we already know from line 7, if it's biblical versus rabbinic, we don't make such calculations. Is it one big sin versus many? Biblical trumps rabbinic. Biblical is a whole different level. So if it's biblical versus biblical or rabbinic versus rabbinic, if the two columns are in the same level, so then you say, well, let's do a one, but only one is bigger than the other for whatever reason. Take the one big one, don't do the many small ones. But if one is biblical and one is rabbinic, of course you don't violate the biblical sin, as we learned in line 7. So therefore, in the case of nodding it versus bowing it, Reb Shimon switches sides and he says, bow it. Choose quantity violations over quality, because this is rabbinic versus biblical, and you cannot make the comparison. However, in this case, all things are equal. Why? Because they're both rabbinic. In this case, both choices are rabbinic. Entering the city is rabbinic because he's walking past the signs that the local Jewish court put up. And as Rabbi Shimon points out, I forgot to mention this, and it's an important detail, that the reason why he allows you to walk past those signs is because when the local court would put them up, they would extend them by 15 cubits to give people a little range for error. So when you see those signs, it's not the actual Shabbos limit of the city. It's been extended 15 feet, give or take. And therefore, Rabbi Shimon says you can go in. Very important detail. Rabbi Shimon points out the reason why you're allowed to enter the city, even though you came up to those stop signs, because those stop signs were not precisely at the 2,000 cubit city limit. There were always another 15 cubits or so extended for safety, so that the person should not violate if they're wandering, taking a walk on Shabbos afternoon. So since those extra 15 cubits are totally rabbinic, parenthetically, there's a whole discussion if the entire Shabbos limit rule is rabbinic or biblical, but let's assume even if it's biblical. But those 15 additional cubits that the sages, that the local courts would put in place before they put up those stop signs, that's certainly rabbinic. So if I come up to that stop sign, if I go in, I'm violating a rabbinic prohibition. Similarly, if I decide to sit outside the city, I'm also violating a rabbinic prohibition of having pleasure on Shabbos. In the Torah, in the Chumash, and the 5 books of Moses, it doesn't say to have pleasure on Shabbos. It says honor Shabbos and guard Shabbos. The mitzvah of la'angoy, of oneg Shabbos, of pleasure, is in the Tanakh and the books of the prophets, which is considered to be rabbinic by comparison. And therefore, although it's very important, but the fact that it's not in the Torah itself, the 5 books, it's in the Tanakh, makes it rabbinic, and therefore deems it on a less level of stringency than biblical law. So therefore, when you look at case number 1 in line 16, I'm standing at the Shabbos limit. If I enter the city, it's a rabbinic prohibition, because those extra 15 feet were just added for extra precaution. If I don't enter the city, I don't have pleasure on Shabbos, it's a rabbinic prohibition. So they're both on equal level. Says Rabbi Shimon, do a bigger sin once than do a whole bunch of small sins. Enter the city and don't violate minute by minute the mitzvah of having pleasure on Shabbos. And why is column A considered a bigger qualitative sin, qualitative violation? As I said earlier, because that's an action, it's not an inaction. Whereas if he stays outside the city, it's just an inaction. And therefore, says the Rebbe, it's fitting that Rabbi Shimon's these two statements are together, even though they seem to be unrelated. And in one case he's strict, and in one case he's lenient. Because really they're both two sides of the same coin. And they're not just a little detail, but they are a principal law in the law of Shabbos. And that is, A, the law, that if you have a choice to violate a big violation versus many small ones, choose one big one. And point number 2, that principle only holds true if both are on equal footing, either both biblical or both rabbinic. But if one is biblical, one is rabbinic, certainly choose the rabbinic violation. And this relates to case number 3, impure rodent found in the temple. This is not Rabbi Shimon's statement. It's 2 other sages that argue. But the Rebbe says, don't you see, it's the same thought process. I have a choice to either remove it with my sash. And this way, I'm not prolonging impurity because I can get it out quickly. But I am increasing the impurity because the sash now contracts the impurity. So qualitatively, it's worse. I've expanded the impurity. There's more quality of impurity in the temple now. However, the flip side is, if I don't take it out with my sash and I wait to find the wooden tongs, which will not contract impurity, I save myself the qualitative expansion of impurity, but it was sitting there for a prolonged period of time. So in a quantity way, it's worse. And the sages debate it. I bolded column A, because according to the flow of the Sicha and according to the logic of Rav Shimon and even Jewish law in line 4, that would probably be the law, that basically we let him take it with his sash. We don't go looking for a wooden tongue, although that would save us expanding the quality of the impurity. We are more concerned with the quantity, minute by minute by minute, prolonging impurity in the temple. We don't want that to happen because both columns here are on an equal footing. They're both impurity. They're both the same level of violation. And in this way, the Rebbe explains brilliantly the last passage of the entire tractate of Eruvin, how it's intertwined, all 3 cases, and how they are teaching us a pivotal lesson about observance of the law of Shabbos and etc. I want to just now pivot away into another section of the Sicha, where the Rebbe talks about the fact that, as we began at the beginning, in the Tractate of Eruvin, there's also a discussion about not carrying from a private domain to a public domain and vice versa, not to be confused with the prohibition of walking past the Shabbos limit. And this is considered a big deal, not to carry outside from a private domain to a public domain. And the Rebbe argues, based on a story in the Medrash, that Rabbi Akiva was having a discussion with a heretic. And the heretic said to Rabbi Akiva, if it's true that God keeps Shabbos, because we know it's said that God keeps all the mitzvahs, how could God make it rain on Shabbos and makes the trees grow and the plants grow and fruits grow? God is violating Shabbos. So how could Jews maintain that God keeps all the laws? So Rabbi Akiva answered the heretic, but the whole world belongs to God. It's his private domain, and therefore he's allowed. That's the conversation in the Medrash. Says the Rebbe, I don't understand. The heretic wasn't just questioning how God could carry on Shabbos from one place to the other. He was questioning how he can make things grow. He can water the field, water the crop, right? Things are growing. There's so much going on in the world that there's technically a violation of many, many Shabbos laws that are proscribed even if you're in a private domain. How does it help to explain that the whole world's God's private domain? If I'm in my private domain, am I allowed to violate the laws of Shabbos? So the Rebbe explains that this conversation of Rabbi Akiva is teaching us that the idea of not carrying from private to public on Shabbos is actually a pivotal, essential, underlying theme of Shabbos, which explains why it's even prohibited to begin with. The laws of Shabbos, there are 39 laws, 38 out of the 39 fit into one of 4 columns, either the process of baking bread from food, from the plowing the field all the way to the baking, cooking, or weaving material from the animal all the way down to the garment, or making a leather material from the animal all the way down to the tapestry or what have you, or the concept of building, starting from raw material down to finishing the process of building. These are the 4 columns of the 39 works, and we learned them from the building of the temple. 38 of the 39 laws of Shabbos fit into one of those 4 categories, with the exception of carrying. Carrying you don't do anything. You're just moving location. Why is it even prohibited? I'm just going to take a quick moment and show you this on a little spreadsheet here, showing the 39 laws of Shabbos. There's 4 categories: field work, material, curtains, leather tapestries, and building. Incidentally, it's a total of 11, 13, 7, and 8 adds up to the 39 laws of Shabbos. By the way, 39 is the numerical gematria of Hashem Echad, God is one. Hashem equals 26, Echad equals 13. Because Shabbos is so pivotal, because it reminds us, it inculcates, infuses within us, and reminds us of our faith that God is one and is the only one, is not only the creator who made the world once upon a time, but is director of the world with divine providence every single moment. That's what Shabbos is all about. And that's why in Shabbos we cease to create. We recognize God as the only creator. But take a look at carrying. It's on the bottom of the last column. And it sort of doesn't fit in there. All the others make sense. They're all part of a process of being a creator. On Shabbos, we stop to create. We recognize God as the only creator. Why is carrying in there? And in the Talmud, in fact, it appears at the end of the list. If you open up the tractate number 7 of the tractate of chapter 7 of the tractate of Shabbos, it lists all 39 laws in one sentence, one paragraph. Carrying is the last one, arguably because it's the least important, if you will. You're doing the least violation, you're not changing anything. It doesn't even fit squarely into any of these categories. And yet, carrying is considered such a big deal that Rabbi Akiva, when he wanted to explain to the heretic why God does not need to keep any of these laws, he said because it is private domain. Somehow that explains that he could do all of these laws. And also, if you take a look at the tractate Shabbos, the first chapter actually begins with the laws of carrying. If carrying is the least important, so to speak, or the last on the list of the 39, why does that open the entire tractate? There's a little bit of a dichotomy here. So the Rebbe explains it by also explaining the conversation Rabbi Akiva had with the heretic. Being that the theme of Shabbos is to remind us of the faith in the one God as the constant creator and the constant director of the entire world, that fits perfectly into the conversation of the public and private domain. What is the spirit of the law? Why we don't carry from a private domain to a public or vice versa? A private domain in Hebrew is called Reshut HaYachid, the domain of the one, the allusion to God, the one God. The public domain is called Reshut HaRabim, the domain of the many, an allusion to an opinion, to a belief system that says that there isn't just one God, God forbid, who runs the world, but the world is pluralistic. It belongs to everybody. Maybe God made it once upon a time, but it's a public domain. It's pluralistic. Everybody do what you want. It's running on its nature. It's running on whatever systems. There's a whole bunch of things at play, which is clearly not the Torah view. The Torah view is that the world is Reshus HaYachid. It's the domain of the one. It's a private domain. It's all God's. Every single thing in the world is constantly created by God. However, to the naked eye, it doesn't seem that way. When Mashiach comes, it is said that if I'll go pick a fig on Shabbos, the fig itself will scream, don't pick me, it's Shabbos. Nature itself will scream that there's a God. All I am is just a puppet in the hands of the puppeteer. Right now, however, the world, the way God made nature for the sake of free choice and what have you, what we see is a world that seems to be a domain of the many. But what we know in our faith and what Shabbos reminds us of, that really the world is a domain of the one. And that's the spirit of the law, or the central underlying message of not carrying from private domain to public or vice versa. We should not confuse. We should have clear lines. We should have clarity that really the world is a private domain, and don't mix in public domains. Don't mix the two. Do not confuse. Do not think for a moment that really the world is pluralistic and it's public and it belongs to so many. It's really a private domain. And therefore, the idea of not violating, carrying on Shabbos is so central. It's that 39th law, but really it's number 1 in the Talmud. And therefore, says Rabbi Akiva, that being that to God, the whole world is his private domain, he doesn't have to keep these laws, because the purpose of these laws is not to be creative, thereby lest I show that I'm in charge, that I'm also a little bit of a creator, that there's not one, that it's not a private domain of the one, of Hashem, but it's a domain of many, including me. But if the whole world is his private domain, it's just his. That's the purpose of Shabbos. There's nothing wrong with him being creative. So the Rebbe introduced now, this is sort of the middle section of the Sicha, the concept that not carrying outside from a public domain to a private domain and vice versa, they represent the notion of the recognition of God's dominion and God's singular control and direction over everything that takes place. And that is central to Shabbos because it's central to the whole belief of a Jew. The Rebbe now segues in line 39. Line 38, the centrality of carrying on Shabbos to Shabbos and Judaism. Line 39, the value of an Eruv. Let's go back to the Eruv discussion. What is an Eruv? And we discussed earlier two types of Eruvs. One is to close in a semi-public domain and make it legal to carry. Another is to expand the Tchum Shabbos, the Shabbos limit. And the Rebbe says they have similar themes. How do they have similar themes? Because again, now that we know the spirit of this concept is the idea of private domain meaning domain of holy, public domain, the idea and the attitude of unholy. If I make an Eruv, I take the unholy and make it holy. Or if I expand my Shabbos limit, I now expand my reach of my holiness. I expand my Shabbos. In either case, I'm expanding the private domain into the public. Either I'm closing the public or I'm expanding the private. Same difference at this point in the Sicha. The idea being we want to expand the domain of the one. We want to expand the domain of Shabbos. We want the holy to infiltrate the domain. And the Rebbe has a fascinating discussion, sort of on a side, but it's fascinating in and of itself. And that's in line 43, the categories of spaces on Shabbos. There's three categories. Line 45, private domain, public domain, and semi-private domain. As we discussed in detail, the private domain is a private home or property. Public domain is a public property that has 600,000 plus passerbys each day. And the shared and the semi-private domain is either a shared property like a courtyard or your local suburban community or what have you, or even a small city where less populated public space, less than 600,000 people passing through a day. And what is the rule of these three? Line 49, private domain has no need for an Eruv. Public domain, you can't put an Eruv because it's biblically proscribed as public. There's no way the sages can decide to make it permissible. However, look, column C, the Eruv comes in the semi-private domain, where biblically you're allowed to carry. The sages, King Solomon particularly, is the one who instituted that now you cannot carry because you're going to confuse it with a public domain. However, he added also a permissibility of the Eruv. A little bit along the lines of the rabbinic principle, Heim Amru ve'Heim Amru, they said and they said. This is a very important concept in Jewish law. The sages prohibit, the sages can permit. But the sages are not permitting biblical law. So therefore, the Eruv is only possible in column C in a semi-private domain, which is really just a rabbinic public domain. So the Rebbe, I have here in line 51, applies it. Again, the spirit of the law, the message of the law is of Eruv, expanding the space of holiness, a space of private. Remember what private means in the context of the Sicha. Rishus HaYachid, the domain of the one God. The private domain means it's a oneness domain. It's a holiness domain. Public domain means it's a plural. It's a manyness domain, for lack of a better term, which means a place that does not shout holiness at all. So the Rebbe says, fill in the blanks. If I'm dealing with column A, categories of spaces of a private domain, what does it mean in terms of my life? Holy objects and activities, mitzvah objects, mitzvah activities. You're lighting candles for Shabbos, you're giving tzedakah, you're wearing your tefillin. It's a mitzvah, it's intrinsically holy. These activities and objects are clearly part of the spiritual domain of the one because they proclaim God. They're mitzvahs. You don't have to make an Eruv. Translation, you don't have to try to make them holy. They're holy in and of itself. Your tefillin is as holy as it gets. Just do it. Conversely, in column B, sinful objects and activities. There are things that God made for whatever reason, God's purpose, that are intrinsically sinful. The unkosher food, the unkosher activity, these things fall into the column of the public domain, or the shus harabim, the domain of plural, the domain, the argument that says, God forbid, that there isn't one owner in charge of our lives and we can do whatever we want. That's the root of sinful activity and behavior and objects, and there no eruv can help. Translation, you can't try to make it holy. Don't make a bracha on your pork. It's pork. Just don't eat it. You can't make it holy. And then there's column C. Column C, the semi-private domain. But this will spiritually represent neutral objects and activities. Kosher food, kosher business ventures, kosher relationships, your leisure activity, whatever it is. These are not your hobbies. These are not mitzvahs. They're not holy. They're not sins. They're just things that you do if you want to do them. You're allowed. It's interesting that it becomes a semi-private domain. In a sense, it's a semi-public domain is probably the better, correct term for this. It's a semi-public domain, meaning in a sense, it's public. It's about life. It's not about God. On the other hand, it's not a sin. It's not public in the negative connotation of that is a sin that says that it's pluralistic. Everyone does what they want. It's kosher. And here we say you can do an eruv, which in the spiritual meaning means that we are encouraged by Torah to find meaning in all of our neutral activities. Our neutral activities are allowed to us, but Torah encourages us, don't just do the neutral activities, don't just make a living, don't just eat kosher food, make a bracha on the kosher food and eat it with an intention. So now you're healthy and happy and you could do mitzvahs. Don't just work and make sure your work is honest, but do your work with an intention to give tzedakah, to take care of your family, to give your children a proper Jewish education, and what have you. So therefore, all human activity, all relationships, even leisure activity, if they have some intention that I'm elevating that behavior for the purpose of serving God better, when it comes to my mitzvah activities, my column C becomes like column A. My neutral activities become holy. My semi-public private domain becomes private. I've privatized it. We're in an age of privatization, right? I've taken those things that seem to have various messages that are unrelated to God and Torah, and I've infused it with, I've enclosed it in an air of, I've made it holy and given it purpose. And I'm touching upon now the final thought of the Sicha, and that is, in line 58, the difference between the prohibition of carrying between domains or walking beyond the Shabbos limit. In the middle part of the Sicha, we spoke about both of them in the same vein. An eruv to enclose a semi-public domain, or an eruv to allow you to carry further beyond the Shabbos limit, the same difference. Both of them expand your Shabbos space, either enclosing an outside space or bringing the inside space out, similar concept. And that is the theme that we just discussed earlier in the second part of the Sicha. But in the latter part of the Sicha, the Rabbi digs even deeper and then takes a beautiful lesson by differentiating between these two. There's a prohibition, be very careful not to carry from the private domain to the public, or vice versa. And there's a separate prohibition. We're putting the area of conversation aside. We're just talking about the actual prohibitions. There's a separate prohibition of not walking beyond the Shabbos limit. Says the Rabbi spiritually, this is based on the Kabbalistic writings. There's a difference. Column A, carrying between domains, is protecting the holy domain from unholiness. Column B, not walking beyond the Shabbos limit, is keeping the holy from wandering to the outside. Two separate things. There's a concept. Don't desecrate Shabbos by bringing in foreign influences into Shabbos. And that is symbolized by the fact, or embodied by the fact, that we don't carry from the outside to the private. Don't bring unholiness into Shabbos. It's Shabbos. And then there's another flip side, so to speak. Don't bring Shabbos to the outside. Don't take your holy things to unholy places. What's the relevance? So the Rebbe applies this in our lives. And that's the takeaway, and that's the final point of the Sicha of line 62. Beautiful takeaway lessons between these two seemingly similar, and yet the Rebbe says very different messages of Shabbos, of A and of B. In column A, we're saying don't carry from the outside to the in, so to speak. Don't make sure to protect the holy domain from the unholiness. This is teaching us how to behave when we're involved in worldly matters. We're told that as a Jew, we have a neshama, a divine soul, and we have a mind and a heart, which are the deepest part of our person, and that's the Shabbos within us. And we are told, this column teaches us a lesson how to behave when we're involved in worldly pursuits. We're involved in making a living, whatever it is. We need to protect our Shabbos space, namely our minds, our hearts. Yes, you're supposed to work for a living, but don't invest your mind. Don't get carried away. Don't look for all kinds of tricks and manipulations. At the end of the day, all you're doing is making a vessel for God's blessing. It's God's blessing that really ultimately provides you the mazel to succeed or not, God forbid. And therefore, do the work. But the language is, do it with your hands. The work of your hands shall you eat. Doesn't mean that you're stupid, but you're not investing your innards, your mind and heart, your focus, your energy, your emotional energy. That's reserved for Torah. That's your Shabbos space. And therefore, the lesson of this column, the lesson of separate the public domain from the private, don't desecrate the Shabbos space, which is symbolic of all the laws of Shabbos we said earlier. Don't come and bring impurity into the space of the holiness. That represents keep your Shabbos, your mind and heart, your most sacred spaces, which God gave you the ability in your mind and heart to experience holiness and true faith. Don't allow that space to be contaminated and bogged down with your worldly matters. Do your worldly work with your hands and feet. Do what you got to do and leave it up to Hashem. Don't get obsessed with your mind and heart. That would be your mind and heart being your inner Shabbos. That would be violating, bringing the outside, so to speak, public domain into your private Shabbos. And then there's another lesson from the idea of not walking outside of the Shabbos limit, even walking. And here the Rebbe takes the lesson, not how to live your life when you're doing business and worldly pursuits, but how to live your life when you're actually doing your Shabbos pursuits, which means you're studying Torah and prayer. And here the point is that when one is studying Torah or doing prayer or mitzvahs, we're supposed to be totally involved. This is different when I'm in worldly pursuits. I'm supposed to do it and be honest about it and be careful and meticulous, but I shouldn't invest my all. My mind and heart should not be so involved and invested. That's not where I should be living. I should just be doing my work. Conversely, though, when I'm doing mitzvahs and I'm praying and studying Torah, I should be totally focused. The language is all of your bodily limbs are proclaiming God's praise. Kol atzmosei temarna. And when I'm involved with Torah study and prayer, even my extremities, even my legs should not leave the Shabbos limit. Now I'm involved in Shabbos. I'm studying Torah. By way of analogy, I'm studying Torah. I shouldn't leave, even with my legs. I shouldn't allow even the external parts of myself to leave, meaning to say I'm totally invested in what I'm doing, in my study of Torah and my mitzvahs, in my Shabbos.